Good morning. Hard act to follow. We're going to try to shift gears from morality and geopolitics to technology and business strategy and see how we will do. I'm Bill Phelps with Accenture's technology consulting organization. John, introduce.
I'm John Hagel. I'm co-chairman of the Center for the Edge at Deloitte in Silicon Valley.
John has written many very interesting things, including the Harvard Business Review article that's over there that hopefully some of you have picked up. He talks about shaping strategies, which I had to read a little bit to understand, but it's an interesting concept of organizations shaping not only their own strategy, but shaping the what I think of as the market ecosystem in which they operate. And I think we can probably all think of examples of that. And I'd like to start off by, John, talk a little bit about, in what I hope is the early stages of a rebound, what is the relevance of shaping markets, and what should companies, particularly technology companies and others, be looking at in this space?
Sure. I guess I'll start just by drawing a contrast. We got into this particular opportunity in a bit of a contrarian mindset relative to conventional wisdom. In a lot of the business strategy world, there's a view that says in times of high uncertainty, basically your winning strategy is an adaptation strategy. It's sense and respond more quickly to what's going on around you, act quickly, and that's how you'll get through it and create value. In some sense, that's actually a pretty passive view of strategy. You're taking what's given to you as a given and reacting to it, and that's where the game is won or lost. Our sense is that there's an increasing opportunity. In times of high uncertainty, you actually have more degrees of freedom to reshape markets and industries than you would in more stable times. Think of a very stable industry and the difficulty of reshaping that versus more and more of the industries that we experience going through fundamental transformations. So the question then becomes, well, how do you reshape a market or industry? And our particular focus is on the notion of positive incentives. And in particular, it has to do with altering a very natural psychological reaction we all have to times of high uncertainty. It's quite natural when confronted with that kind of situation to magnify risk. You think of all the things that could go wrong and discount the rewards. You think of all the reasons why those rewards aren't going to materialize. And if you take that kind of mindset in times of high uncertainty, it freezes you. Basically, you try not to do anything if at all possible, or if you have to move, you move in very marginal or incremental ways. The challenge and the opportunity for a shaper is to fundamentally alter that equation, to magnify the perception of reward and discount the perception of risk. And the way we see that happening, and looking at successful shapers in the past, has to do with three elements coming together. On the first hand, it's the notion of having a clear and compelling shaping view, a long-term view of the future that helps to focus all the participants in the ecosystem and direct their investment in certain areas versus others. The second element is some kind of shaping platform, something that materially alters the economics for the participants. It provides economic leverage, it reduces the investment required to participate, and accelerates the revenues and profits that can come from that investment. And then you have a third element which has to do with shaping acts and assets. It's a pretty diverse set of options, but it has to do with addressing the question of credibility. In times of high uncertainty, you can have a pretty compelling view of the future, you can have a pretty interesting platform, but there's always going to be that skepticism to say, can this company pull it off? Or do they really have what it takes to make it happen? And we've seen a set of actions and assets that can help to reassure people and get those participants to believe in the view and the platform. So that's all context to the question of why now. I think two reasons. One that has to do with a short term related to the downturn, and that has to do with the perception of increased uncertainty. We all have huge uncertainty about where we're going at this point. I mean, it was uncertain even in the good times, but now it's even more uncertain. And from our perspective and experience, that's when shaping strategies are particularly useful, because you have the opportunity to alter that perception and increase the view of rewards and discount the perceived risks. There's another element which is a longer-term answer to the question of why now, which has to do with two trend lines that are rarely seen together, but are pretty interesting when you combine them. The first trend line has to do with the exponential price-performance improvement in core technology building blocks. And whether you're talking about computing, storage, or bandwidth, that price-performance curve continues to go up even in economic downturns. We're seeing continued innovation at the core component level. So there's an exponential curve going up, and then compare that with another curve, which is business productivity improvement over time. That's a much flatter line, modest improvements, 2 to 3% is considered really good here in the US. There's a growing gap between that potential that's delivered from the technology and what businesses are doing to harness that potential. So it creates, on the one hand, increased uncertainty. Somehow, somewhere, that gap is going to get closer. I mean, it'll never close completely. There are a lot of reasons productivity doesn't map totally to technology performance. But that gap is going to close. There's a lot of upside. If somebody can figure out how to close that gap, there are a lot of rewards to spread around to this ecosystem to motivate them to get involved. And by the way, that digital infrastructure makes it much easier to coordinate action and connect with a much larger ecosystem than was ever possible in the past.
Just picking up on that point that I think of as a real paradox about investment in technology, and obviously, from my background, I spent a lot of time with enterprise IT people. There seems to be quite widespread skepticism about the productivity impact of investments in technology. In addition, there is huge downward pressure on enterprise IT budgets. The Radar Group report that Mark had sent out, talking about the downward impact on budgets from cloud computing and other things. Every day I'm in the market, I'm seeing that. We talk to CEOs and ask them what they want from IT, and they say, I want what I had yesterday, but I want it cheaper. In that kind of an environment of skepticism about the benefits, but hard-nosed downward pressure on pricing, what should technology companies be doing in terms of trying to shape this marketplace to restore some growth?
Well, it's a great question. I think there are a lot of dimensions to it, but one in particular that I'll highlight has to do with the notion of mindsets and focus, both on the technology provider side and on the technology buyer side, which I think has to, gross generalization, and I'm sure I'll be called on it, but I would say that over the past 2 or 3 decades, if you look at the overall IT spend, particularly in the enterprise market, it's been driven largely by cost reduction, productivity in the form of cost reduction. Automate, pull people out wherever possible, standardize processes, and get that cost out, squeeze it out. And actually, benefits have been delivered on that level, although not as much as probably promised by the technology providers or expected by the buyers. On the other hand, it's a diminishing returns game. I mean, you can only squeeze that much cost out of the business, and each increment of cost reduction is going to get harder and harder, take more and more effort. So I think the real challenge is shifting the mindset and say, beyond cost reduction, where and how can IT really make a difference in terms of enhancing the value that's delivered to the marketplace? I mean, productivity ultimately has 2 components. There's a numerator, which is the value. There's the denominator, which is the cost. And everybody's focused on that denominator. It's time, I think, to look at that numerator and say, where and how does technology really make a difference there? And I'll just quickly mention a pet peeve of mine in terms of cloud computing, which you mentioned as one of the latest innovations that's become a buzzword in the industry. I think it's huge, but I worry that the way it's being positioned with corporate decision makers is it's basically just another form of low-cost outsourcing. It's a way to reduce your IT costs further. Yeah. Okay, great. There are huge risks associated with that reduction of IT cost, but yeah, maybe. There's a lot of controversy over exactly how much IT cost actually comes out. On the other hand, if you think about the cloud and moving IT resources into a broader infrastructure, it creates entirely different ways of organizing the technology, new architectures become feasible, new value can be delivered to the businesses and their partners. And I think one of the key opportunities is actually using the cloud to enhance collaboration across large ecosystems of partners. That doesn't get nearly as much time and attention as I think it should if you were really pursuing a shaping strategy view of where does cloud take you over time. Is it just doing the same thing you've always done, cheaper, faster? Or is it something else? And if so, what?
Kind of picking up somewhat on the point of the value versus just the cost reduction. It seems like, at least throughout my career, every generation of fundamentally new technology, has been adopted, outside of traditional IT first, whether it was, PCs or even going back to mini computers or web browsers or anything else. And that seems to have exploded with, what a lot of people, including myself, use, the consumerization of IT, that all of us are our own technologist. I was at a conference last year with a set of smaller companies that said, we try to sell to the individual. We want to have technology solutions for the enterprise that the employee can buy with a credit card. So not only bypassing IT, which is a time-trusted, time-proven approach to selling, to sell to the business, but even getting to the point of selling to the individual. So in thinking about selling technology, do companies need to be fundamentally rethinking who the buyers are and who's in control in the organization and who the key influencers are going to be?
Absolutely. It's a great observation. Both historically, we tend to forget most new technology has been driven into the enterprise from the edge and often without the awareness or even the support of the central IT function. I think that trend, if anything, is intensifying for a number of reasons. I mean, one of the key factors has to do with the incentive structures for CIOs. CIOs are getting fired with increasing frequency. Their tenure levels are diminishing. The major reason they get fired is something blows up. There's a major system downfall. What's the best way to avoid system crashes? Don't add anything new to that system. That's a huge risk. And from my viewpoint, again, gross overgeneralization, but CIOs more and more are becoming the equivalent of the corporate counsel, where their job is to focus on all the risks, emphasize all the risks, and wherever possible, stop those risks from occurring. And that's very hard to get over that kind of incentive structure if you're selling new, innovative technology. On the other side, I think business executives, line managers, line executives are becoming much more tech savvy, much more comfortable in making decisions and choices and weighing risk factors versus business benefits with regard to technology. So they're more willing to step up. And then you have the other issue, which is the lower cost of entry. Yeah. More and more of this new technology, as you said, you can buy into it on a trial basis in particular at a very low investment rate and try it and see if it works, see if it delivers the promise, and then scale up from there. So for a variety of reasons, I think this is one of the biggest challenges that tech companies face. By and large, again, major generalization, but tech companies have made their success, and particularly the larger enterprise ones, on building tight relationships with the CIO. They know how to talk with the CIO. They know how to build a case for them. They have a much harder time engaging with a line executive, with a chief financial officer, and making a compelling business case around why this new technology can solve a real pressing business problem. And I think in that context, this value of shaping strategies becomes front and center. A shaping strategy view of the future and a platform that has real economic benefit can become a very significant way to engage with these line managers and really get them on side, get them to be the champions. You still have to deal with the CIO, and I think there's a value proposition that says help to bring these two increasingly distrustful groups together and help them to align around a business objective. But in my mind, the key challenge, particularly for any technology company that's coming in with new technology, innovative technology, is how do you go and find champions in the rest of the organization? that will actually drive this into the business.
So it sounds like part of what you need to shape is the customer perception of what you're delivering and what the ecosystem is delivering.
Yeah, again, it gets to the question of who is the customer in this case, right? Is it the CIO that you're trying to shape the mindset of? Well, good luck. I would be much more advising tech companies to focus on who are the business line managers that will see the greatest value out of this and who are wrestling with broader business challenges. And again, I think it's getting out of this cost reduction mindset and proposition and saying, how is this technology going to help you deliver more value and reshape in the process your market or industry?
I think, John, you've kind of said this from a couple different angles, but maybe talk explicitly. It sounds like you're saying the measures of success that are traditionally used aren't necessarily driving the right behavior from a technology standpoint, at least in large organizations. If you were talking to, particularly a business unit owner or a CEO about technology, what would you suggest as alternatives to traditional cost and productivity as things that they could measure?
Well, I think I'm a big believer in pragmatic migration paths, so I wouldn't just shift away from cost reduction and say that's irrelevant. I think you have to build on that concern and focus and advance to a different set of values that can drive the promise. One example that I give, and I've done only anecdotal research in this, so I guess not compelling, but I have a strong instinct. This is a huge economic force within the enterprise today. If you went in and asked an average line manager how much of their headcount is focused, where are they spending their time, the headcount? First of all, they'd be somewhat puzzled, have a hard time answering that. But if you probe, at least the experiences I've had, somewhere on the order of 2/3 of that headcount is spent focused on exception handling. Situations that get thrown out of these standardized automated systems because they don't fit the policies that have been defined for the process. It gets thrown out, it gets handed off, literally handed, there's not a lot of technology here, to somebody in the organization told you have to resolve this exception. And by the way, you have maybe 24 hours, if you're lucky 48 hours to get this done. So you have to go out as an individual, find other people, because typically resolving these exceptions involves not just one person, but a number of people in different parts of the organization. They have to get access to relevant data, analytic tools, and resolve it, and then throw it back in. Now, all this is done relatively manually today. So one consequence of that is it's very inefficient, high cost. Another consequence is it's invisible. So if I ask an average executive, what's the pattern in the exceptions you're seeing? Which exceptions are truly one-off, one-time thing that's never going to reoccur, but you needed to resolve it, versus, by the way, there are a set of exceptions that are occurring with increasing frequency. And it's because needs in the marketplace have changed or capabilities of suppliers have changed. Something is different that our policies and processes had not anticipated. That's invisible. We don't know. We don't know what those patterns are. And if we could have visibility on those patterns, that would be a really interesting early indicator of innovation opportunities, because that's where there's something that needs to be done, something that needs to be changed in the processes to anticipate emerging needs or capabilities. So I think that that's the kind of need on the part of companies. The other need I'll just highlight as quickly is, I think there's, over the past several decades, there's been a trend, particularly in US companies, to narrow the number of business partners you have in your supply chain operations, distribution channels, in the name of efficiency. Again, you want to reduce the complexity overhead of managing all those people. You want bargaining power to squeeze more out of those people, not often said publicly, but a key motivator. And so over time, you've seen fewer and fewer participants in these extended business processes. You sacrifice a lot in doing that. You sacrifice flexibility, you sacrifice the access to more highly specialized talent and capability among all these potential participants. What would be the technology platforms that could actually support connecting to a larger number of business partners without incurring the kinds of complexity overheads that we encounter today. That would be a very interesting proposition to advance to companies. You get lower costs, but you also get enhanced flexibility, enhanced value from a higher degree of specialization, more learning, more performance improvement across that ecosystem. That's a pretty powerful proposition. I don't hear many tech companies really leading in markets with that point of view.
That's interesting. What was running through my mind is, I hear so many times, well, let's focus on the 80-20, with the implication almost always being, let's solve for the 80% and not worry about the rest of it. And in my work, I certainly see an increasing number of examples where what's interesting is in the 20%. And I think that's related to what John is saying.
Yeah, although in the case of exception handling, that 20% is actually closer to the 80%, but it's invisible. And again, I think there's a reason for that. It has to do with embarrassment. I mean, on the side of the tech providers, they went in with the proposition they were going to automate all this stuff. No human touch required. Well, guess what? That's never happened and won't happen. And on the side of the buyers who authorized investment in a huge amount of money, admitting that the substantial portion of the people in the organization are dealing with exceptions that these process systems couldn't handle, that's pretty embarrassing. Right. So it's the invisible economy of the enterprise that I think is really a rich area to target from a technology viewpoint.
It's interesting. We'll talk for a couple more minutes and then probably throw it open to 2 or 3 questions. Things I was wondering about is, in your article on shaping strategies, you talk about some of the interesting examples of different companies doing it. Are there organizations that you're seeing today that you would kind of hold out as examples and say they're doing it particularly well? They're doing a great job of influencing the market in which they're operating.
I think the examples that we see today are more in the tech field than in other industries, and I think that's actually a huge opportunity, is to take this shaping strategy into other industries, often using technology innovation as a key driver. But in the tech industry, I guess I would highlight a couple of companies that certainly seem to have been successful, although jury's still out in some cases. One is certainly Google in the advertising space, interactive advertising. They've reshaped and are reshaping how advertising is done. And have had a compelling view of it, a platform, and been very successful in bringing a lot of people into the ecosystem. And by the way, typically in these shaping strategies, when you talk about ecosystems, we're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of participants, not a few key strategic partners. So Google, I think, has done that very well. Facebook in the social network space is a very aggressive shaper, although interestingly enough, the shaping view that they have is much more a social view than an economic view. And I think there are actually some very interesting options to play shaping strategies within that broader social platform that are more economically focused, more business oriented. And another one that I think is again an interesting example of a rapid evolution of strategy is Salesforce.com in software as a service. And one of the interesting things to me is in the early days when Salesforce came into the marketplace, and you went to a conference like this and heard Mark Benioff talk about just talk, 80 to 90% of his talk would be about this view of the software industry and where it was headed and why packaged software was no longer going to be viable and obsolete. And then, by the way, at the last moment, he would say, and by the way, we have a company that offers software as a service. But it was all around evangelizing this very compelling view of the future of the software industry. And over time, he's migrated what was initially a product into a platform with an increasing range of participants that shows a lot of promise.
There's a pitch, that's a joke in VC circles when a company comes in and says, this is our idea, and we're going to go out there, and it's going to become the standard. And when it becomes the standard, we're going to make lots of money. And we all know how often that's successful. You know, is a successful shaping strategy in some ways attempting to realize that vision of establishing a standard, you know, obviously much broader than a technology standard, but a standard approach with, you know, norms and everything that goes along with that?
Right. It's a great question. I think the notion of increasing returns, network effects is very compelling, very powerful. I think what most people fail to recognize is the success rate of getting to that critical mass where you have the increasing returns kick in is very, very low. The failure rate's enormously high. And so the whole focus of shaping strategies has to do with that critical time between entry and achievement of the critical mass. How do you motivate people to more rapidly embrace the platform, embrace the view of the future so that you can get those increasing returns to occur? That's where I think the power of this strategy is.
Okay, I think we've got time for at least one, maybe two questions for John. And I'm having trouble seeing, so if you at the mic.
We have a roaming mic here, so if anybody wants to raise their hands, we can go either side of the room.
Hi, John. Mark Teely. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I really appreciated the conversation you had about who you message to in the environment, whether it's the CEO or CFO or CIO. A lot of the stuff that I've worked on recently, even some of my own blog entries, have been around the same subject, and I'd love to get your impression on why or how we can breach the gap between the message that we need to get to the CIO about why we can either enable more business opportunity through their infrastructure and their IT investments, or save them money and reduce their risk, but get past the message that they've been given from the business from the dawn of time, which is don't do anything that disrupts my environment, right? So on the one hand, you've got a CEO who's hammering on the table saying save me some money, but on the other hand, you've got a CFO, or maybe even the CEO on the next day saying whatever you do, don't mess with me,
Yeah.
right? Like, I mean, who hasn't heard you never get fired for buying Microsoft, right?
Right.
So,
Used
I
to
mean,
be
you know,
idea.
until we get past that
Right.
at the enterprise IT level, the problem you're describing will never go away.
No, absolutely, and I don't want to minimize the challenges at all. There's a huge cultural gap, semantic gap, you name it. There's a gap that needs to be bridged. From the experiences that I've had working with clients in this area, the approach that has the most potential is, again, being thoughtful about what the value proposition is from an economic viewpoint to line managers, and figuring out which line manager has the biggest pain point, if you will. On the one hand, either pain point, they're suffering and they got to do something fast to fix the problem. Or alternatively, they're really visionary, driven by growing their business and willing to take risks to get there. But if they don't meet either of those profiles, they're probably not going to be very receptive to a proposition. And then I think it's also a question of crafting a business case. So again, generalization, large tech companies have gotten addicted to the mega sale. And so the business case has to be about billions of dollars over a 10-year period. And by the way, most of the returns aren't going to come until that 8th or 9th year, but trust me, they're out there. Versus a business proposition that says, over the next 6 to 12 months, with relatively modest investment, we can deliver these tangible business benefits or business value to you. Try it. If it doesn't work in a modest effort, then, you know, walk away. But if it works, then you can scale it up and take it into other parts of the business. I think that's part of the economic challenge that tech providers face, is by and large, the sales organizations are not organized, incentivized to really go after those micro sales and use reference selling throughout the enterprise to spread the adoption over time. But in my mind, that's the key, is getting that champion. And if you, from my experience, if you deliver to a line executive a compelling business case that says you're going to get tangible results in 6 to 12 months at your biggest pain point, boy, I'd like to meet the line exec who's going to sit back and say, wait a minute, don't do anything new here. They're going to embrace that, and they're going to become champions for it, and they will go with you to the CIO and make the case. And CIOs, by and large, are pretty responsive when a line executive is coming to them. As you said, right now the message more often than not is cut costs, do the same with less. But if a business executive is coming into the CIO's office and saying, I got this real challenging performance problem, I'm convinced this technology can help me on this, are you with me, what are your issues? Then I think there's, again, a bridging gap, because there are risks, and the CIO does have a legitimate rationale in terms of focusing on risks and helping to understand them. But you got to be able to address that objection as a second-order challenge.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. I think we're
Thank you.